15th century Hungary experienced an unprecedented historical phenomenon. One family emerged from anonymity to completely dominate the destiny of a European kingdom across 2 consecutive generations. The Hunyadis appeared on the Hungarian political horizon like a blazing comet streaking across the night sky, leaving a luminous trail impossible to ignore. Their legacy transformed Central European history so profoundly that when they finally disappeared, the entire kingdom was plunged into a darkness from which it would never fully recover. The first protagonist of this saga was János Hunyadi, a man whose personal trajectory defied every social convention of the medieval era. He started his career as a simple page serving Hungarian nobility, a position reserved for young men without resources who aspired to learn the military craft. But against all odds established by Europe's rigid feudal system, János climbed the ranks until he became governor of the Kingdom of Hungary. His ascent didn't stop there. Eventually, all of Christendom placed its hopes of survival in him against the Ottoman threat. Pope Pius II described him with words that revealed all of Europe's desperation. János was the only man the Turks truly feared, and therefore represented Christianity's greatest hope at a critical moment in history. The second figure of this dynasty was Matthias Hunyadi, who inherited his father's legacy but transformed it into something completely different. Matthias became a Renaissance monarch who commanded the feared Black Army, a professional military force that caused terror on Central European battlefields. Among his most remembered feats is the imprisonment of Prince Vlad Tepes, known in history as Dracula, the sadistic ruler of Wallachia whose atrocities scandalized even an era accustomed to extreme violence. But Matthias wasn't just a warrior. His reputation transcended military victories to transform into folkloric legend. More than 100 Hungarian folk tales narrate stories about his legendary sense of justice and exceptional wisdom, turning him into a mythical figure that still lives on in Hungarian collective memory. But before reaching these extraordinary heights, the Hunyadis had to face obstacles that would have destroyed any other family. János's father was Vojk, a relatively modest nobleman whose valor in combat caught the attention of King Sigismund of Hungary. As a reward for his battlefield bravery, the monarch granted him Hunyad Castle, a medieval fortress located in Transylvania. His son János would later transform this property into a magnificent knight's castle, an imposing structure that reflected the family's military power. It was precisely from this castle that the dynasty adopted its surname, Hunyadi, the name that would be etched into European history. However, Vojk's ethnic origin generated controversies that persisted for generations. Contemporary historians' opinions were deeply divided. Some scholars defended a South Slavic background, arguing linguistic and cultural connections with Balkan peoples. Other academics pointed to more convincing evidence of Romanian origin, based on period documents suggesting links to Vlach communities in Transylvania. But there was a third version that was even more controversial and potentially scandalous. During Vojk's lifetime, persistent rumors circulated questioning János's paternity. According to these whispers in courtly circles, young János wasn't really Vojk's son, but the fruit of a secret, illegitimate relationship between his mother and King Sigismund himself. This version would explain János's meteoric rise and the royal favor he consistently received throughout his career. When Matthias reached the throne decades later, his official historian, Antonio Bonfini, presented a completely different narrative designed to legitimize the dynasty. According to Bonfini, the Hunyadis descended directly from the distinguished Roman Corvinus family, a noble connection supposedly evidenced by the raven emblem the family used on their coat of arms. However, Matthias's contemporaries weren't completely convinced by this conveniently constructed genealogy. Regardless of these disputes about his ethnic origin, the social norms of the medieval era clearly established Vojk's position. As Lord of Hunyad Castle, he was officially considered a Hungarian nobleman, with all the rights and privileges corresponding to his social status and class. Therefore, his son János automatically inherited noble status, which allowed him to begin a military career within the kingdom's structures. Young János Hunyadi began his service as a page in southern Hungary, a region that constituted the permanent frontier against Ottoman incursions. This geographical location proved crucial for his military formation. Unlike nobles who lived in the relatively safe interior of the kingdom, János gained direct experience fighting against the Turks from his youth. Each Ottoman raid represented an opportunity to learn the military tactics of Europe's most dangerous enemy. In 1430, King Sigismund made a decision that would change János's destiny. The monarch took him to Italy, the cultural and military epicenter of the European Renaissance. The young knight spent 2 full years at the Duke of Milan's court, one of the era's most militarily advanced Italian states. During this formative period, János had the extraordinary opportunity to master modern Italian military arts, which represented the vanguard of European war strategy. He learned about advanced fortifications, innovative artillery, sophisticated cavalry tactics, and siege strategies he would later apply against the Ottomans. By the time he turned 30, János had accumulated considerable combat experience that few nobles of his generation could match. In 1439, he received his first important appointment. He was designated Ban of Sorang, a position that made him directly responsible for defending the kingdom's southern territories. These territories constituted Hungary's most dangerous zone, constantly threatened by Turkish invasions. 2 years later, in 1441, his exceptional performance was rewarded with an even more significant promotion. János was named Voivode of Transylvania, which elevated him to the rank of an influential baron within the country's power structure. This promotion placed him among the Hungarian political and military elite. However, his new post didn't turn out to be a comfortable or ceremonial position. The Ottomans regularly invaded Transylvania, executing devastating plundering operations that left a trail of destruction in their wake. These military expeditions razed entire settlements, looted properties, and kidnapped hundreds of people who were then sold as slaves in Ottoman Empire markets. Transylvania's population lived in constant terror of these incursions. But the trust placed in János Hunyadi was about to be validated in a way nobody anticipated. Spring 1442 marked the moment when János Hunyadi proved that the trust placed in him hadn't been a mistake. Ottoman commander Mezid Bey invaded Transylvania at the head of a considerable army, following the usual strategy of territorial devastation. But this time, the outcome would be completely different. János didn't just defend the territory, he completely expelled Mezid Bey's forces from Transylvania, inflicting significant losses. This initial victory sent shockwaves throughout the European world. Finally, a Christian commander had demonstrated that the Ottomans could be defeated. But János didn't settle for a defensive victory. By autumn of that same year, his military ambition had expanded dramatically. When the Bey of Rumelia invaded Wallachia at the command of a massive 40,000-man army, János took the offensive initiative. He didn't wait for the Turks to attack Hungarian territory. Instead, he marched south to intercept them. In a battle that defied all military expectations of the era, János completely defeated this 40,000-man Ottoman army, a force that significantly outnumbered his troops. But the victory didn't end there. He continued pursuing the remnants of the Turkish army, penetrating deep into Ottoman territory all the way to Bulgaria. These unprecedented victories generated a wave of enthusiasm throughout European Christendom. After decades of continuous defeats to Ottoman advance, there finally existed a Christian commander who not only defended territory, but took the offensive and won. News of Hunyadi's triumphs traveled quickly to Rome, where they were received with euphoria. The Pope, seeing an opportunity that hadn't existed in generations, declared a new crusade with the explicit objective of completely expelling the Turks from Europe, and he made an unprecedented decision. He designated János Hunyadi as supreme commander of this crusade, a Hungarian nobleman of questionable origin who barely a decade earlier was a regional voivode, now officially led all of Christendom's military hope. The 1443 campaign represented the high point of Hunyadi's military success. During this offensive, János was victorious in all 6 battles he fought against Ottoman forces, a record of consecutive victories no Christian commander had achieved in decades. His armies liberated parts of Serbia and Bulgaria, territories that had been under Ottoman rule for years. For the first time in generations, it genuinely seemed possible that Turkish advance could be reversed. However, the logistical reality of medieval warfare soon imposed limitations that not even Hunyadi's military genius could overcome. An exceptionally harsh winter punished the Christian troops. Horses, essential for the cavalry that formed the core of Hungarian military power, began falling massively ill due to extreme cold and lack of adequate fodder. Difficulties obtaining supplies became critical. Supply lines from Hungary to the liberated territories in the Balkans stretched dangerously thin. Finally, despite his tactical victories, Hunyadi was forced to order a retreat toward Hungary. He'd won all battles, but winter conditions denied him definitive strategic victory. But a year later, what seemed like an opportunity for redemption would become the greatest military tragedy of Hunyadi's career. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how an undefeated commander can lose a war, because what comes next reveals the most devastating strategic mistake of the medieval Crusades. In 1444, the Crusaders, led by Hunyadi and young King Vladislaus I of Hungary and Poland, organized a new massive offensive toward the Balkans. The initial expedition showed promising signs. They managed to capture the city of Varna, a strategic port on the Black Sea. Enthusiasm coursed through Christian ranks. It seemed the previous year's campaign, despite its winter retreat, had sufficiently weakened the Ottomans to allow permanent territorial gains. But then a chain of coordination failures began that would doom the entire campaign. The Albanian prince's troops, whose participation had been promised and was considered essential for the operation's success, simply never arrived on the battlefield. The exact reasons for their absence remain disputed by historians, but the result was catastrophic. The Christian army lacked a significant portion of the forces it had counted on in its strategic plans. But the real treacherous blow came from a completely unexpected direction. The papal naval fleet, composed of Genoese and Venetian ships, had an absolutely critical mission: prevent Sultan Murad II's main force from crossing the Bosporus from Anatolia to Europe. If the Christian fleet successfully blocked the strait, the Sultan would be trapped on the Asian side, while his European army faced the Crusaders without reinforcements. This was the key to the Christian military plan. However, something happened that revealed the moral corruption at the heart of the Crusades. The Genoese sailors, supposedly fighting for the Christian faith, accepted bribes from the Ottoman Sultan. In exchange for 1 gold coin per soldier transported, these Christian sailors betrayed their own cause. They actively transported tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers across the Bosphorus, allowing Murad II's main force to reunite with his European army. The betrayal was so blatant and mercenary, it scandalized even the lax standards of the era. When Christian forces finally faced the Ottoman army at the Battle of Varna, it initially seemed Hunyadi's military genius might overcome even these catastrophic disadvantages. His tactics were working. The Sultan's army showed signs of weakening. A genuine possibility of victory existed despite all obstacles. But then, young King Vladislaus, barely 20 years old, committed an error that would change the course of European history. Swept up in the excitement of combat and the premature belief that victory was already secured, the impetuous monarch completely ignored Hunyadi's battle plan. He personally led the Polish cavalry in a reckless charge directly at Sultan Murad II's position. He sought personal glory by capturing or killing the Ottoman leader. The tactic proved suicidal. The Ottoman elite guard, the Janissaries, quickly surrounded the Polish cavalry. King Vladislaus died on the battlefield, his body beheaded by the Janissaries. His head was impaled on a spear and displayed to demoralize the Christian troops. The effect was immediate and devastating. Seeing their king's head on a pike, the Christian army panicked. The battle Hunyadi was winning transformed into a crushing defeat. Survivors fled in disarray, pursued by Turkish cavalry. Despite this catastrophe, János Hunyadi refused to accept that the situation was irreversible. 4 years later, in 1448, he organized one last attempt to reverse the balance of power. He marched south again and faced Ottoman forces at Kosovo, Serbia, a battlefield loaded with historical symbolism where the Serbs had been decisively defeated by the Turks in 1389. Hunyadi hoped to change that cursed place's fate. But the defeat at Kosovo was complete and definitive. The balance of power had changed irrevocably. The Ottoman Empire's resources simply exceeded what Hungary and its unstable allies could mobilize. After Kosovo, it became painfully clear that expelling Islam from Europe was no longer a militarily feasible objective. The Ottoman Empire had consolidated as a superpower, rivaling any Christian kingdom. The question was no longer whether Christendom would conquer Constantinople, but whether the Christian kingdoms themselves, including Hungary, could survive Ottoman thrust. But while military hopes faded, János Hunyadi was about to gain something no battlefield victory had ever granted him. During the Arpad and Anjou dynasties, power in Hungary had been firmly concentrated in the monarch's hands. Kings dictated policies, controlled the treasury, appointed officers, and decided matters of war and peace with almost absolute authority. But toward the end of the 14th century, this power structure began to fundamentally transform. The Hungarian parliament started assuming an increasingly significant role in the country's administration, gradually eroding royal authority. This parliament's composition reflected medieval Hungary's social structure. The barons, members of the high nobility who controlled vast territories and private armies, occupied the most powerful seats. Ecclesiastical dignitaries, bishops and archbishops who controlled church wealth, constituted another influential bloc. But most notable was the participation of the lesser nobility, a social group counting tens of thousands of members. These lesser nobles could participate in parliamentary meetings, either personally or through county delegates. This massive participation made the Hungarian parliament a relatively representative institution by medieval standards. However, the limits of this representation were brutally clear. City delegates attended sessions but had no voice in final decisions. Serfs, who constituted the majority of the Hungarian population, had no representation whatsoever, exactly like their counterparts throughout Europe. Parliament represented only the privileged classes. Despite these limitations, Parliament and the estates of the realm exercised considerable power, especially in one crucial area: succession to the throne. From Sigismund's reign onward, Hungarian monarchs couldn't simply assume the crown by hereditary right. Before being crowned, they had to accept conditions imposed by the estates and solemnly swear they would respect the country's traditional liberties. This requirement transformed the Hungarian monarchy from an absolutist institution to a semi-constitutional one. In 1446, Parliament convened an extraordinary session at Rákos, near Pest. The Hungarian nobility faced a complicated dilemma. Young King Ladislaus V was still a minor and required a regent to govern the kingdom during his minority. The decision they made was revolutionary. In a vote reflecting both political realism and recognition of military merit, Parliament elected János Hunyadi as governor of Hungary. This appointment completely transformed Hunyadi's position. Although nominally just a temporary regent until the young king reached majority, in practice, János became the effective ruler of the kingdom. He exercised this office for 7 full years, controlling all aspects of government. He personally managed royal revenues, the kingdom's treasury. He controlled strategic royal fortresses distributed throughout the country. And when his official term as governor finally ended, Hunyadi simply refused to return these castles and resources. He retained them as personal property, openly defying young King Ladislaus V. The warrior who had saved Europe from the Turks was now Hungary's most powerful man, controlling more resources than the monarch himself. But fate had one last test prepared that would define his legacy forever. Drop a like if these political battles are surprising you, because the most shocking crisis of the Hunyadi dynasty hasn't arrived yet. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II accomplished what seemed impossible. He captured Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire's capital that had resisted sieges for over 1,000 years. Constantinople's fall profoundly shocked all of European Christendom. It wasn't simply the loss of a city, but the collapse of the last bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire. The psychological shock was devastating. If Constantinople, with its legendary walls that had resisted countless sieges, had fallen, what city could truly be considered safe? The Pope immediately called for a new crusade, his voice filled with desperation and urgency. The German Imperial Assembly convened to consider a formal declaration of war against the Turks. There were meetings, passionate speeches, endless debates about the existential threat the Ottoman Empire represented. But no decisive action was taken. German princes returned to their territories, French and English kings, occupied with their own wars, sent no armies. Europe talked much, but did little. Only one person responded to the Pope's call with concrete actions. Giovanni da Capistrano, an Italian Franciscan preacher of extraordinary charisma, traveled to Hungary. Despite his advanced age, he traveled through the Hungarian countryside, giving passionate speeches that deeply moved those who heard him. His rhetoric was so powerful, his call to defend Christendom so convincing, that he managed to persuade thousands of peasants and townspeople to join the army. Many of these recruits had never wielded a weapon in their lives, but Capistrano's religious passion transformed them into soldiers willing to die for their faith. His contribution would prove absolutely crucial. In summer 1456, Sultan Mehmed II, intoxicated by his victory at Constantinople and convinced of his invincibility, personally led a massive army of 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers toward Hungary. This was an enormous military force by medieval European standards, where most battles involved merely thousands of combatants. The Sultan's target was Nándor-Fehérvár Castle, currently known as Belgrade. This fortress controlled the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, making it the strategic gateway to Hungary's heart. If Nándor-Fehérvár fell, the road to Budapest would lie open. Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihály Szilágyi, defended the castle, commanding 5,000 men. It was a competent garrison, but numerically insignificant, facing tens of thousands of Ottomans. The siege officially began on July 4th. Mehmed deployed the most powerful artillery arsenal existing at that historical moment. More than 150 cannons of various calibers began bombarding the castle walls. This artillery's roar was deafening, audible for miles around. Stone and metal projectiles pounded the medieval fortifications day and night, without rest, gradually pulverizing the defenses. János Hunyadi's army, composed of 12,000 men, reached the castle on July 14th, exactly 10 days after the siege's start. But there was a critical problem. The Turks had established a complete naval blockade on the river. Ottoman ships patrolled the Danube waters, preventing any communication or reinforcement to the besieged castle. Hunyadi needed to break that blockade to have any chance of changing the battle's course. With the help of Serbian boatmen who intimately knew the river's currents, Hunyadi launched a bold naval attack. The river battle that followed was bloody and chaotic. Ships crashed into each other, soldiers fought hand-to-hand on blood-slippery decks, archers fired from both banks. Finally, after hours of desperate combat, Hunyadi managed to break the Turkish blockade. Along with several thousand crusaders recruited by Capistrano, he penetrated the besieged castle, reinforcing the exhausted garrison that had resisted bombardment for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Juan de Capistrano led the remaining crusaders and camped on the left bank of the Sava River, from where he could observe the siege's development. His presence maintained the defenders' morale, and his constant prayers convinced the soldiers that God was on their side. After 2 weeks of constant, relentless bombardment, the castle walls had collapsed in several critical places. The fortress looked more like an open field than a defensive structure. The walls that had protected Nándor-Fehérvár for generations were now piles of rubble. Mehmed, confident that victory was imminent, ordered a general assault. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers, shouting war cries, threw themselves at the breaches in the walls. But what happened next surprised all participants. The Crusaders Capistrano had gathered, driven by religious fervor and with no military tactical sense, completely ignored their commander's orders. They began shouting that God was ordering them to attack immediately. Capistrano, swept up in his followers' frenzy, started urging the Crusaders to launch a counterattack. The situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Mehmed II, seeing this chaotic Christian charge, committed a fatal tactical error. He mobilized the elite Rumelian corps to crush these disorganized crusaders, but in doing so, left his artillery completely unprotected. Hunyadi, with the genius instinct of a commander born for battle, instantly recognized the opportunity. He charged out of the castle at the head of his cavalry, broke through the disorganized Turkish lines, and took possession of the Ottoman cannons. His men turned these artillery pieces around and began firing at the Turkish army itself. The psychological effect was devastating. The Sultan's army suffered catastrophic losses. Approximately 30,000 Ottoman soldiers died in the chaos that followed. All his artillery arsenal, those 150 pieces that had hammered the walls for weeks, fell into Christian hands. The victory was so complete, it left Mehmed II, Constantinople's conqueror, fleeing in panic back toward Ottoman territory. Hunyadi was euphoric. After years of strategic defeats and tactical victories without lasting consequences, he'd finally achieved a decisive victory that fundamentally changed the balance of power. With the Sultan defeated and demoralized, with the Ottoman army shattered, Hunyadi genuinely believed the moment had arrived. He could gather a massive Christian army, march south while the Turks were weakened, and finally expel Islam from Europe. It was his life's dream, now tangibly within reach. But fate is cruelly ironic. Barely 2 weeks after his greatest triumph, the victory that should have been the start of his definitive campaign, János Hunyadi died in the military camp. The plague, that medieval disease that respected neither courage nor rank, killed him. The man who had survived dozens of battles, who had faced Ottoman armies countless times, who had constantly risked his life for decades, died from an illness. His opportunity to expel the Turks from Europe died with him. But the Hunyadi family drama was just beginning.
Just before the 1456 siege, an extraordinary astronomical phenomenon appeared in European skies. Halley's Comet, with its long, bright tail visible even during daytime, crossed the firmament. For medieval Europeans, deeply superstitious and convinced that the heavens communicated divine messages, this comet was interpreted as a dark omen. The belief spread that the comet announced Turkish invasion and foretold Christendom's end. Pope Calixtus III, responding to this collective fear, decreed that the entire Christian world should pray for Hunyadi's victory each evening while church bells rang. These prayers and bells were to continue until the Turkish threat was defeated. When news of the Nandor Fehérvár victory arrived, the celebration was so intense that bell ringing was maintained as tradition. However, to facilitate parish's daily life, the schedule was changed from sunset to noon. Since then, and to this day, Catholic church bells worldwide ring at noon. This daily tolling commemorates János Hunyadi's victory, transforming his triumph into a religious ritual that has endured for nearly 6 centuries. János Hunyadi had had 2 sons, László and Matthias. László, the elder son, naturally aspired to follow his legendary father's military and political footsteps, but a group of Hungarian barons, led by nobleman László Garai, had reached a dangerous conclusion. The Hunyadi family had accumulated too much power. They controlled strategic castles throughout the kingdom. They commanded the loyalty of thousands of soldiers. They managed financial resources rivaling the king's own. The Garais and their allies felt the time had come to put an end to the Hunyadi's ever-increasing fortune before this family completely replaced the traditional Hungarian aristocracy. Tension between factions exploded into violence when men loyal to young Laszlo Hunyadi massacred one of the main figures in Garai's camp. The political assassination unleashed a crisis threatening to plunge Hungary into civil war. King Ladislaus V, still an inexperienced youth, found himself trapped between the kingdom's two most powerful aristocratic factions. Terrified by what he'd witnessed and by the possibility of devastating civil war, King Ladislaus V initially promised personal immunity to Laszlo Hunyadi. He swore he wouldn't be punished for his men's actions, but it was a trap carefully designed by the Hunyadi's enemies. Once Laszlo trusted the king's word and presented himself at court, he was immediately arrested. The immunity promise was completely ignored. Laszlo Hunyadi was beheaded in Buda in a public execution designed to humiliate the entire family. His younger brother, Matthias, was captured and transported as a prisoner to Prague, far from the Hungarian power center, where he would remain at the mercy of his family's political enemies. The wealth accumulated by János during decades of military service was confiscated. The castles that had been the Hunyadi power base were redistributed among nobles of the Garai faction. The family's good fortune seemed to have reached a sudden, catastrophic end. But then something happened that nobody, absolutely nobody, could have anticipated.
King Ladislaus V died unexpectedly. The exact circumstances of his death remain subject to historical debate. Some chroniclers suggested poisoning, others spoke of sudden illness, but regardless of the cause, the result was the same. Hungary's throne was suddenly vacant. Matthias's maternal uncle, Mihai Szilágyi, the same man who had defended Nándorfehérvár during the siege, led the political faction that had remained loyal to the Hunyadis. He gathered 15,000 armed men and marched towards Pest for the new monarch's election. This military demonstration wasn't a diplomatic suggestion, it was a direct threat. The message was absolutely clear. The Hunyadi faction wouldn't accept any candidate not to their liking. In negotiations held at Buda's royal castle, the Garai faction, facing overwhelming military force, was forced to yield. They accepted the election of Matthias Hunyadi as King of Hungary. When the announcement was publicly proclaimed, crowds of Hungarians who had been waiting outside in the Danube's frozen waters erupted in unanimous cheers. The hero who had saved Europe from the Turk's Sun would now be their king. But there was a considerable technical problem. The elected king was still a prisoner in Prague. Matthias, barely 15 years old, had to be brought back to Buda under complex diplomatic circumstances. When he finally arrived in Hungary, he discovered his coronation would be indefinitely delayed by a symbolic but politically devastating problem. Emperor Frederick III had stolen Hungary's holy crown, the sacred ceremonial object without which no coronation was considered completely legitimate. Despite this ceremonial obstacle, Matthias firmly established his control over the country from the first moment. After removing Palatine Garai from his post, thus sending an unmistakable signal that the Garai era had ended, he rejected his uncle Mihai Szilágyi's tutelage, who expected to govern as regent behind the young king. Matthias even had his uncle temporarily imprisoned when he protested too vigorously, demonstrating an iron will that surprised all observers. His main supports during this initial period were the Pope, who gratefully remembered János Hunyadi's sacrifice, and members of the lesser nobility, who saw in Matthias an opportunity to break the great baron's power monopoly. Matthias strategically appointed people of lower social status to several important positions. Vitez János, a man from the lesser nobility who had been Matthias's tutor, was appointed to lead the chancellery and was subsequently elevated to Archbishop of Esztergom, Hungary's highest ecclesiastical position. János Ernest, a Jewish merchant converted to Christianity, oversaw the kingdom's finances, and there's a particularly famous legend about Paul Kinii, Matthias's renowned military commander, who, according to popular stories, began his career as a young miller.
But recovering the Holy Crown remained an obsessive political priority for Matthias. It would take him years of intermittent conflict with Emperor Frederick III and payment of an exorbitant sum of 80,000 florins, approximately 20% of the Hungarian kingdom's total annual income at that time. But Matthias finally accomplished his objective. The Holy Crown returned to Hungary, and his official coronation could finally be celebrated, completely legitimizing his reign. But now that he'd secured the throne, Matthias had to decide what kind of king he'd become.
Matthias Hunyadi had two inspiring models that defined his ambitions as a monarch. The first was obviously his father, János Hunyadi, who had successfully defended Christian Europe from the conquering Ottoman Empire and had become a living legend. The second was his predecessor, Sigismund, who had ascended from the position of Hungarian king to become Holy Roman Emperor, Europe's nominally most powerful ruler. Matthias aspired to combine these two legacies, protect Christendom from the Turks while simultaneously expanding his political power to rival emperors. To achieve such ambitious objectives, Matthias first had to completely reform the kingdom's finances. The Hungarian tax system was obsolete and full of legal loopholes, allowing nobles to avoid paying taxes. Matthias replaced the antiquated toll tax with the smoke tax, collected per family instead of per property. This reform closed the legal loophole most used by nobility. He also introduced a war tax of 1 florin per family, sometimes collected twice yearly during intense conflict periods. Through these strict fiscal policies, implemented mercilessly against nobles attempting tax evasion, Matthias managed to generate an astonishing annual income of 700,000 florins. To put this figure in perspective, it probably exceeded the English king's income, making Hungary one of Europe's richest kingdoms. This money wasn't wasted on courtly luxuries, but strategically invested in the instrument that would define Matthias's reign, the famous Black Army. The Black Army represented a revolutionary military innovation for 15th century Europe. It was a permanent, professional force composed of 10 to 20,000 soldiers, receiving regular salaries and constant training. Unlike traditional feudal armies, temporary levies of peasants and vassals, the Black Army consisted of professional warriors completely dedicated to the military craft. This force caused terror on Central European battlefields due to its discipline, superior training, and cutting-edge equipment. Matthias's contemporaries and many later historians harshly criticized him for wasting resources on military campaigns against Czechs and Austrians, which they considered to have dubious results, instead of directing all efforts toward the fight against the Turks. This criticism, however, is fundamentally unfair and demonstrates a lack of strategic understanding.
Matthias had carefully learned from his father's mistakes. János Hunyadi had led multiple ambitious crusades with supposed support from Balkan nations, but these alliances consistently failed at critical moments. The Battle of Varna had demonstrated that promises of military support from other Christian kingdoms weren't worth the paper they were written on. Matthias recognized a brutal reality. Even with full support from Balkan states, the Hungarian kingdom's resources would still be insufficient for a successful offensive against the Sultan's vast Ottoman Empire. The Turks simply had too large a demographic and economic base. Instead, Matthias ordered massive fortification of Hungary's borders. He invested enormous amounts in construction and renovation of frontier castles, creating a deep defense system that made it extremely costly for Ottomans to penetrate Hungarian territory. This defensive strategy proved remarkably successful. For nearly half a century, it completely stopped Turkish conquest. While other Balkan kingdoms fell one after another to Ottoman advance, Hungary remained secure behind its fortifications. In 1468, Matthias embarked on his campaigns toward the north and west. He captured the cities of Brno and Olomouc, important centers of the Czech kingdom. A year later, in 1469, he was crowned King of Bohemia, though this title was disputed by a rival Czech king. He also captured Silesia during a complex conflict against Czech and Polish kings in 1474. Finally, in 1485, he achieved his most symbolic conquest. He took Vienna,
the seat of Emperor Frederick III, who had humiliated Hungary by stealing the Holy Crown. Although Matthias didn't achieve his main objective, unification of Central European resources under a single crown, his strategic vision was correct. That necessary unification would be carried out later by the Habsburgs, who would inherit the Hungarian throne and create the multinational empire Matthias had envisioned. But Matthias wasn't just a military conqueror.
Under Matthias's reign, the Hungarian economy experienced remarkable growth. Trade flourished thanks to security provided by the Black Army and protected trade routes. Guild industries developed in Hungarian cities, producing manufactured goods that competed in quality with Western European products. During the 15th and 16th centuries, coaches and carriages manufactured in Koch, a village located in Komárom County, became extremely popular throughout Europe. These vehicles, known for their superior comfort and robust construction, were so in demand that the village's name transformed into a Hungarian linguistic loan existing in almost every European language. The term coach in English, kucha in German, coche in Spanish, and coach in French all originally referred to these horse-drawn carriages manufactured in Hungary. It's a remarkable testament to Hungarian economic and cultural impact during this period that a simple Hungarian village gave its name to a vehicle type in dozens of languages. But Matthias's most impressive legacy was cultural. His court transformed into the European center of Renaissance culture. The Bibliotheca Corviana, his personal library, was considered the second most valuable book collection of its era, surpassed only by the Vatican's legendary library. The collection attracted intellectuals from across Europe to the Hungarian capital. Italian writers, foreign scholars, and renowned artists worked at court and received generous royal support. The Bibliotheca Corviana's illuminated manuscripts, decorated with the Hunyadi family's raven emblem, were artistic masterpieces as well as knowledge repositories. During this period, humanist culture also spread among Hungarians themselves. The era's most renowned Hungarian poet, János Pannonius, praised the king in elaborate Latin verses demonstrating the literary sophistication achieved by Hungarian intellectuals. After Matthias imprisoned the sadistic prince of Wallachia, Vlad Tepes, also known as Dracula, whose atrocities had horrified all of Europe, Pannonius wrote celebrating, "Sing a festive song, the tyrant finally wears chains." Foreign visitors arriving at Matthias's court were constantly astonished by the magnificence of Buda and Visegrad's royal palaces. These buildings had been restored and expanded following Italian Renaissance architectural principles. During festivities, wine literally flowed from fountains installed in palace gardens, a demonstration of wealth and hospitality that profoundly impressed foreign ambassadors. Andras Hess's printing press in Buda also began operations with direct support from Matthias. The first book printed in Hungary, the Chronica Hungarorum, which narrated the country's complete history from its mythical origins, was produced here in 1473. This achievement placed Hungary at the forefront of the printing revolution. To put this in historical perspective, the first book was printed in Hungary 3 full years before the first printing press began operations in England. However, the Renaissance culture so enthusiastically promoted by the royal court and Archbishop Vitezianos failed to extend throughout the country. The majority of Hungarians' population, peasants and small-town inhabitants, remained completely oblivious to the intellectual debates and artistic innovations fascinating the urban elite. Attempts to establish a permanent university in Hungary also failed repeatedly. After Louis the Great's attempt at establishing a university in Pécs and Sigmund's in Óbuda, Matthias founded a university in Pozsony. But, like his predecessors, it proved a short-lived enterprise. The university closed shortly after Matthias's death. Hungary would have to wait centuries for a permanent higher education institution. Matthias's strict fiscal policies and tyrannical personality made him a deeply unpopular monarch during his lifetime. Nobles hated him because he forced them to pay taxes they'd evaded for generations. Peasants complained about financial burdens the Black Army imposed on them. Barons resented the promotion of men of lower status to power positions. When Matthias died in 1490, many Hungarians probably felt relief. But Matthias's death quickly returned the population under the country's barons' oppression. Without the king's centralizing power, the high nobility recovered absolute control over the kingdom. Fiscal reforms were dismantled. The Black Army was dissolved as too costly. Frontier fortifications were neglected. And most devastating of all, the Turks resumed their northward advance without the effective resistance Matthias had organized. This chain of disasters essentially led to medieval Hungary's destruction. In 1526, barely 36 years after Matthias's death, the Hungarian army would be crushed at the Battle of Mohács by Ottoman forces. King Louis II would die in battle. Hungary would be divided among the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Kingdom, and the Principality of Transylvania. The unified, powerful kingdom Matthias had governed would cease to exist for over 3 centuries. As a result of this catastrophic collapse, people began remembering King Matthias's reign with deep nostalgia. They forgot his onerous taxes and authoritarian personality. Instead, they remembered the security, justice, and relative prosperity of his era. Popular stories spread about the disguised king who supposedly mingled with common people to directly hear their complaints and correct injustices committed by corrupt nobles. These folktales reflected popular longing for a ruler who would defend the poor against the powerful's abuses. A popular Hungarian saying perfectly captured the sentiment, "Matthias died, justice died." This phrase became a proverb Hungarians would repeat for centuries, expressing the belief that Hungary's golden age had ended with Matthias Hunyadi's death. The son of the general who saved Europe from the Turks transformed into a legend, the last truly great king Hungary would know before its conquest and fragmentation.
Smash that subscribe button if this story changed your perspective on how a single family can determine an entire kingdom's fate. Because every week I break down the forgotten dynasties that transformed medieval Europe.